Record this.
Wonderful.
Bob Ingram, Bethesda, Maryland, out of Cleveland, Ohio.
There we go. See, all these places that are near home. I've driven, I was literally in D.C. earlier this week. I flew from D.C. here.
Bethesda, Maryland.
Okay.
Fred Thompson, Canton, Ohio, but now in Denver, Colorado.
Gotcha. Do you ever get confused at an airport for the famous one, and then they see you and they're disappointed?
I just tell them I'm the smart one.
Okay. I'm the one who didn't want to do Law and Order. That's awesome.
Lee Johns from Chagrin Falls, Ohio.
Okay.
Dave Majic, 8 months in Florida, Sebring, 4 months in Cortland, Ohio.
Okay.
I'm Bob Heimbaugh from Palm Springs, California.
Wonderful.
Stu Bailey, Brexville.
Excellent.
Dontavius Gerald, I'm from Cleveland, but now I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
Rodney Jacobs, Philadelphia, now New York City.
Wonderful. And I don't know who you are.
Oh, I'm just a tech guy. So.
Was that sound?
Yeah, you needed help with the sound.
Yes, if you could make some magic happen with the sound, that would be wonderful. All right. I have been having some difficulty getting the sound, so if you could work on that, that would be great. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the politics of sports, and I'm going to let this gentleman sort of run through this here because I have the entire lecture in my head. And one of the general things about my lecture style, and those former students of mine can speak to this, and anyone else who's ever worked with me can speak with this, is I do a lot of Q&A. It's sort of very much of a Socratic method. So I'm going to be walking around the room and asking you all questions and engaging as much as possible. What I always say to my students is, look, if I have to be here for 90 minutes, I certainly want to be entertained. And so I try to make sure that the class is engaging as possible for my students. So, why the politics of sports in general? Well, the reason is because, overall, our relationships between politics and sports are very symbolic. What it takes to be an effective politician, what it takes to be effective and long-term and entertaining as a sport are very, very similar. Okay? Both, in America, require a ton of money. Can't be in politics without a lot of money. Sports require a tremendous amount of money to start leagues, to fund leagues, to buy equipment. And similar to politicians, the amount of money that you can acquire, the amount of money that you can retain has a lot to do with how successful you're going to be, and a lot to do with what kind of politics that you get in. If you happen to be a self-made millionaire, you're going to run for Senate. Right? If you happen to be a self-made thousandaire, you're going to run for board president or something else like that. It makes a difference. If you come from a tremendous amount of money, maybe you could play hockey in high school. But if you don't come from a lot of money, you might play something like basketball, which, believe it or not, is actually a lot cheaper to play at a youth level than even things like soccer, because you don't require a field and maintenance and things of that sort. Next, both require heroes. To retain our interest and to get our engagement, there has to be a certain amount of myth making, right? That's what holds a society together. Whether it's Paul Bunyan, whether it's, Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer, we have to have legends and myths that bring us together as a society. Okay? Now, those legends and myths will change over time. If you talk to your kids, your grandkids, or students I talk to now, their notions of heroes are probably, Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, whereas it might have been Tom Sawyer, or it might have been James Bond, or it might have been Johnny Quest 30, 40, 50 years ago. But regardless of the time period, we all need our myths in order to have a collective relationship with the society that we're in. Anybody running for office has to have a myth around them. Okay? Hillary Clinton has myths around her. Okay? All the great things she's accomplished, how she was this great and wonderful, strong wife to this ne'er-do-well husband that she had and still accomplished things and did all this great and wonderful stuff. That's her myth. Now, you can believe it or not believe it, but that's the myth. That's the story that we get into. And when it comes to sports, it's the same sort of thing. Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, there's a myth. These great, fantastic figures of higher level of caliber and discipline, etc., etc. So myth making is key to both of these activities. And next to last, Collective action. A couple of people here are married, as I figured out from hearing that you're in the same city, or it's just an amazing coincidence that everybody took the same bus. Okay? But outside of our families, okay, how many of you guys have ever heard of the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam? It's an amazing book. It's a really, really good book. And let's see, the last version is about 2007, 2008. It talks about this idea of social capital and what actually brings people together and why we connect as people. He says that, you know, American social capital has been declining. In the 50s and 60s, we had bowling leagues and people didn't move as much, so you knew your neighbors. And, you know, a lot of the things that we have happening in society today is because people are simply not connected. You can click and you can email and you can text, but that's a different kind of connection than actually knowing your next door neighbor, right? Because I can email somebody all the time and I still don't necessarily know what they look like, and someone can still rob their house because I don't know them, right? But if you know your neighbor, you can like, wait a minute, that doesn't look like the McGillicuddies, and I'm going to call the police, okay? Now, one of the ways that sports has always been valuable in American society and in world global societies in general is it gives us something to rally around that is actually fairly low stakes, which is really hard to do when you're putting a society together, right? You can rally people around war, but that gets expensive and bloody. You can rally people around, hate the Russians, hate the Japanese, hate the brown people, hate the black people, hate the Jewish people, hate the Chinese people. You can do all that stuff, but it's bloody and it's problematic, and when it's all over, there tend to be hurt feelings. With sports, you can rally people around something that is very intense and very emotional, but the consequences aren't that high, right? When the Browns lose, you may be depressed, you may be grumpy, but the Browns have lost. No one died, hopefully. No one got hurt, hopefully. There weren't too many riots, okay? And so, in all of these ways, politics brings us together over collective ideas, where the consequences won't be that high because it's just voting. Right? You can like Obama, you can dislike Obama, but it doesn't necessarily destroy the country. He's only going to be in office for 2 more years, right? Whatever you don't like about him, the next guy will fix. And whatever you didn't like about Bush, maybe Obama fixes it. Because we have a functional economy. We can all rally around the fact that we have a president and they're going to be in a transition period. We can all rally around these sports teams one way or another because we know when they win, they lose, everybody moves on. Okay? So that's why these ideas are connected. But what we've been seeing in the last 2 or 3 years in this country is a really bizarre raising of the stakes in sports. Sports in this country have moved beyond just entertainment, and they have become a social and political petri dish, the likes of which we have not seen since the 1960s. Okay? And lots of people can argue, well, why this may be happening. It's just, no, it is fundamentally different what we have been seeing in sports in this country. And there's a couple reasons for that. But I'm going to step back a bit, and I'm going to tell you all very quickly why this was a particularly challenging lecture when I first got this. And this applies to why sports and how sports have changed so much. So what happens is I was talking to John Coyne. How many of you guys met John Coyne? All right, well, I met John. John's a good guy. And usually I give a lecture about campaigns and elections. And I'll talk about 2014, 2016, blah, blah, blah. He's like, oh, let's do something different. You do all these talks about sports and pop culture and everything else like that. How about you do a politics of sports lecture? Now, when I had that idea, and John and I discussed it, it was around late January or February. It was before the Super Bowl. So at the time, I was thinking, oh, well, that's fine. I'll probably talk about the labor lockout. You know, I may talk about, this impending Super Bowl. I may talk about some of those big, and maybe I'll throw in some Tiger Woods or something else like that. And literally, since late January of this year, I would say we have not gone 3 weeks without a sports story being on the front page of the news. And if you think about it, the stories that we're hearing about sports now, they're not scandals. It used to be you heard about sports because famous athlete X is caught at a strip club, because famous athlete X is caught cheating on his or her wife, because famous athlete X blew all of their money that they won from something and now they're living destitute. But no, what we're hearing about now regarding sports are labor issues and race issues and culture issues and financial issues. Donald Sterling. Oh, this is a whole story there. Donald Sterling, Michael Sam, openly gay player going into the NFL. We have controversies with the World Cup and how it's been paid for. We have serious discussions about NFL concussion rules. We have multi-million-dollar ad campaigns going out right now to try and get the Redskins to change their name. We have all of these different issues that have been popping up in sports, and none of which really fundamentally have to do with someone's bad behavior. They have to do with what our expectations are about how our society is reflected in the sports that we see. And so that was sort of the motivation behind doing this. And again, it became significantly more complicated because literally this week, when the World Cup sort of controversy came out, I was like, wow, okay, there's this other thing that I have to end up adding. So, at their core, we know why politics and sports interact with each other. And we know why politics and sports are important. But here are the specifics of how each of these things relate to each other and what these fundamental sports mean. Okay? If you're a politician, sports is a great place to raise money. First off, athletes have a lot of cash. Politicians want to associate themselves with cash. The second thing is politicians want to associate themselves with key sporting events because it is one of the most open and freest places that you can contact all sorts of different kinds of people who are going to be tricked into hearing you speak. Right? Think about it. The president, whether you like him or not, always goes out and throws the first pitch in a baseball game. He's going to make you see him. Okay? You don't have to like him, but he's going to be there. That's why the politicians get involved. Politicians also recruit from sports. Lots of former athletes have run for higher office. Maybe not professionals, but it is a good place to go. Whether it's Steve Largent, whether it's Jack Kemp. I mean, like literally every single year, some party, Republican or Democrat, will say, look, we've got an empty seat, could you run? We know you've got money, and it'll be great if we could get Len Swan to be a senator in Pennsylvania. Right? That's important. So we have it from the recruiting standpoint, we have it from the symbolic standpoint, and lastly, and this is also very, very key, it is a way to sort of inoculate the public towards other things that you may or may not have accomplished in the city. Okay? So what do I mean by this? If I am a mayor, what's something I could be proud of if I was mayor?
Infrastructure development.
A new highway, what else?
Low crime rate.
Low crime rate, right? Now, that's a perfect example because that's highly subjective, right? If you're a mayor of a big enough city, crime is about what people think is happening as opposed to what's actually happening. You can have very safe cities, and if people don't feel safe because one or two high-profile events have happened, then you're going to lose your job anyway, right? I mean, because crime rates actually in America have been going down for the last 15 years. It doesn't necessarily make you feel safe if you live in certain parts of Cleveland or certain parts of New York, right? But even if you make a road, even if your schools are technically better, as a mayor, there is nothing that makes me look better than when a championship parade is happening downtown in my city. And as a governor, there's nothing that's going to help me bring more money to my state than if I have 1, 2, possibly 3 multi-team cities. It matters if your city has a football, baseball, and basketball team. If you look at the most prominent cities in the United States, they are 3-team cities. Tremendous amount of money being raised, and also it gives you opportunities for all sorts of largesse from the standpoint of national championships can be held there, stadiums, conventions, etc., etc. So politically, there's always this connection with sports. Now, what do sports need from politicians? What are the technical things that they get? Well, very simply, first off, they get protection. It's really expensive to put together a sports league. Okay? It's really expensive to keep other people out of the competition. The NFL basically operates like a cartel. So does the NBA, so does the NCAA. Most of our sports leagues are incredibly protected by the federal government so that they don't face competition from anybody else. They also get regulation, because if you leave it to a bunch of rich business guys to regulate their sports, they're not going to do it. So Congress has to get involved and say, all right guys, please don't tell me you're using steroids, right? Because the NCAA won't do anything. But they do occasionally have to have some sort of government entity come in and control things and make sure things are relatively safe. But here's the other thing that sports depends on. Taxes. Not a sports league in this country that's not completely dependent on your taxes. For all that free market capitalism nonsense that I hear these sports owners say all the time, they have no problem taking money out of your pocket to build their stadiums to have suites that you can't afford to stay in. Okay? And that's always fascinated me that you'll have some multimillionaire baseball owner or football owner or basketball owner say, I'm so poor, and they're doing the sort of money bags thing and empty pockets, and I need $27 million in your tax abatement money. I know your schools are terrible. Anyway, so I can get a new stadium. And if you don't give me a new stadium, what do? Move. I'm going to move. I'm going to threaten you with a move. So you're going to have to basically bankroll my private entity. Every team works that way. And they're dependent on it. They can't function without your tax money under any circumstances. And I'm a sports fan, and I realize that those are pretty ridiculous shenanigans. And if you look at most of the deals that are happening in a lot of cities throughout the United States, it's not just a matter of giving tax money in order for a team to be there. Because teams, they bring jobs, they bring money. What's always been really fascinating to me is what they won't give back. And what they don't give back in terms of, say, road construction. It's amazing how often a new stadium gets built, and the team will say, all right, we're going to put this many people to work, and we're going to give this tax money back. But yeah, we're actually not going to put any money into improving the highway system, so when your traffic gets gnarled up because my new stadium got built, that's on you taxpayers to fix. Okay? So, all sports teams absolutely dependent on your taxes. Here's the other way they're dependent on your taxes. Because they get the best training programs in the world. Public schools and colleges, which you pay for with your taxes. See, I own the Dallas, I won't even say I'm here, that would be awful. I own a team. I own fill-in-the-blank professional team, okay? And how many of you here are in a management position? Or have been? Okay, a couple. And how many people here have ever had to train people? It's an investment, isn't it? Because you've got to, what's the first thing you have to do when you're in a management position? You got to go and, you got to hire people, right? That takes time. You got to travel, you got to find these people, you got to hire them, then you have to check their background, then you have to bring them in, then you have to interview them, then you have to discover in some shape, way, or form if they fit your organization. You have spent, in actual human hours, probably a third of their salary before they sit down at their desk to ask you what they're supposed to do next Monday. Okay? And that's a lot of money out of your company. Well, guess what most sports teams get to do? Most of that training process is taken care of by your tax money because we pay for schools to have sports. And a lot of public universities, we pay for those with our taxes. So the NFL owner and the NBA owner, he or she can say, well, actually, a lot of my recruiting is saved because all I have to do is go down to Ohio State, which all of you pay for. Okay? So there's a very sort of strong and symbolic relationship between both of these. They have to, sports cannot exist in this country without politicians and without government, and government cannot exist symbolically without the money and resources that come from sports. Now, when we get into our sports, and I always like talking about our big three, why are they important, right? We see the technical things. NFL, MLB, and NBA. Because at their core, all of the big three sports in the United States represent something very fundamental about how our country has evolved. Okay? So, go back in time with me. Go back in time with me. How many of you guys played baseball? Okay? How many of you guys played softball? Baseball, softball. Okay, wonderful. Baseball is our oldest sport in this country. It's also, I mean, you can say golf, but golf isn't a major sport. Okay? Baseball is the oldest sport that we have in this country, and baseball is nature. It is the most natural sport that we have in this country. If you consider how baseball is played, okay, first off, wooden bats, okay, leather for the ball, balls around wood, everything that you need in baseball actually comes from nature. It grows from the ground, or it's just life, okay? Baseball moves like seasons, first, second, third, first, second, third. Okay? It does not change, just like winter, spring, summer, and fall. Baseball moves like our seasons does. And in addition, baseball is timeless, which is what nature is. Nature continues no matter what the circumstances are. Nature is timeless. It doesn't matter if it's 1947, 1957, 1997, or 2057. Nature goes the same way, and that's how our sports operate. Time is a human invention. That's why baseball games, it's been very difficult for baseball to connect with millennials because millennials don't have attention spans, and I'm a Gen Xer, I don't either. But you know, a lot of older generations, like, they don't mind going to a baseball game, which may last 4 hours, right? Because time does not play a role in how baseball operates. It is a natural agrarian sport, and it's at the core. That's why it's America's game, symbolically, if not financially and popularity-wise. So what comes? Oh,
I just have to throw this in. I heard this summer. It's also the only game in which the object is to go home.
that's true. I like that. I like that. I can use that in the future. That's true. Everyone else is to score or goal. So we move from baseball, and our next major sport is football. Football is industry. It is the Industrial Revolution. It is multiple parts that make up a whole. It is trench warfare, okay? Unlike every other sport, football is the most contended sport in the United States on situational but not collective expertise. Your job, if you've ever played football, if you have children who play football, is your job is to do your job and let the guy next to you do his. If you do what you're supposed to do as defensive end, and the other guy does his job, and the other guy does his job, then everyone else is fine. You are a machine, and the engine is the quarterback. He runs the machine. The individual parts cannot function on their own. The individual parts aren't even capable of being interchanged for the most part. You might be able to switch a defensive end, but not really. You can't really switch your wide receiver with a tight end. It's a completely different body type, completely different way of studying. Okay? Football requires the most training of all of our sports. It requires the most weight training. It requires the most food training. How many of you guys, anybody here have family members in the NFL? Okay. Have you ever seen a playbook?
Yeah.
It's huge. It's huge. It's like a Victorian Bible. And you get one every week. Okay? It is incredibly complicated. You have to memorize all of these different plays every single week. You don't actually have to do that in baseball, right? Because you're going to hit the ball. You know how certain plays work. But again, it's nature. It's pretty simple. You hit the ball and run. It's not. There's different ways you can hit it, but football it's a machine sport. And how does it operate? It comes around like trench warfare. You're moving from space to space. Football is also the sport that requires the most management, right? Baseball, it's nature. I'm just planting my seeds and it goes around in circles. Football, I've got to have a coach and I have to use time. Time is absolutely key. Time is a human creation. So that's how we get football. And we move to our last sort of major sport and we get to basketball. Basketball is postmodern. Basketball is the future. First of all, it's the most technical of all the sports, right? Because what do you have to play basketball?
A ball.
A ball. But what kind of ball?
A bouncing ball.
A bouncing ball. Vulcanized rubber. I mean, they started with leather, but that didn't really work very long, okay? You literally at the core, because you can play football with kind of anything, right? But basketball at its very core requires a technological advancement. You have to have a ball that bounces. You have to be indoors, or you have to have some sort of set asphalt to play on. It requires human invention, okay? And also, I think from sort of a musical standpoint, basketball is jazz. Basketball is improvisation. Basketball is a sport where we have what we call field generals. Like, the coach in basketball actually does the least out of any coach. Why? Because you have to depend on the guys out there actually know what they're doing. Broken play, they got to figure it out. Football's like, no, do this. I'm bringing in a new wide receiver every single play to tell you what the play is. It's got to be written on your arm. Guess what? Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Larry Bird, they didn't have plays on their arm in basketball because the game moves too fast. You have to be innovative and creative in the process. You have to create this music, this cacophony of bodies and technology and time and space and lacquer and wood and lights and baskets in order for basketball to work. And so that's how all these sports sort of relate to our notions of how America operates. We were an agrarian society. And then we moved into an industrial society. And then we moved from being an industrial society into a postmodern technical society. And that's where we exist today. And that's why all of these sports resonate with us, not just at particular times in history, but they resonate with us at particular ages. We play baseball when we're young, we play football when we're physically strong, and we play basketball when we're old like the president, because it's a game that allows you to think of it. Okay? One thing I want to show you very quickly I can bring this and make this larger. Okay. There we go. Now, how are these things connected? When we think of that philosophical base of these sports, how are those things actually connected to how we live our lives and how we vote? I've always loved this chart, and they do one every single election cycle. Is a connection between how strong your partisan leanings are and what your favorite sports are. And as you can see, football, big Republicans. Basketball, more likely to be Democrats. What do you notice about sports in general, though, just looking at the chart? Yeah, people who are big fans of sports tend to skew Republican anyway. Most of the politicians who've come out of sports who run for office, they tend to be Republicans, especially football players. You know, most of the sports politicians who've come out, they've been football players. But if you look, pro wrestling, interesting enough, highly Democratic. That always shocks me. Yeah, I know. It seems. Goodness gracious.
Well, there he is.
I think of where he's.
There we go. Goodness gracious. But this is key, and I always think this is interesting. Pro wrestling, you're more Democratic. Monster trucks and extreme sports, more Democratic. It's very odd. And yet, Olympics, much more likely to be Republican. Why? Because Olympics is also very nationalistic, very patriotic. Okay? WNBA, women's tennis, men's tennis. And you notice also the physicality of the sports tends to skew depending on what side you are. The mental acumen for the sports tends to skew depending on what side you are. NASCAR versus NBA. NASCAR, which is mechanical, it's a physical sport. Doesn't mean you don't have to be smart to be a NASCAR driver, but it's a different kind of intelligence of what you have to be a basketball player. Okay? And so when politicians interact with athletics, they use these sorts of things, they use these sorts of metrics to decide which sports they're going to associate themselves with. So I'm Mitt Romney. Of course I'm going to talk about the Olympics. I'm a Republican. I know the Olympics matters to what my constituent base is. I'm Barack Obama. I played basketball in high school. Of course I'm going to talk about basketball all the time. Of course Michelle Obama is going to be doing public service announcements with the Miami Heat after they won the championship last year. Because I know that also has to affect and interest my particular constituency. Now here's how this ends up getting complicated and where we're actually heading to. Any progress?
I think that's about it. I don't know what's wrong with the system.
So here's where this all ends up heading. I'm just going to keep with the PowerPoint. No second. By the way, Rodney's a former student. He used to do this for me all the time. Yeah, once you guys are set with that, I need to go back to the PowerPoint. So, now that we see how the politicians sort of relate to this, a few quick things, and we see sort of where the future of sports relationships are going. So we go back to this fundamental idea that the sports represent these different parts of American society. But why then, when we get to all these scandals, when we get to Donald Sterling, when we get to the labor lockouts, when we get to, why has that become such key news? Why has it everybody's begun to care about that? Why do you think? Why do you think those things have become so prominent on the news lately, not the sports pages? Why do you think that's happening? Politics are heating up. That's close. It's close. You guys have a guess? Societal issues? Much of this has to do with the Great Recession that we were in. Increased economic and social instability leads to a higher focus on sports. It's bread and circuses, if you ever saw Gladiator, right? People are nervous. They are anxious. They cannot keep their jobs. Their jobs are not as stable as they used to be. People are being hired and fired back at the same job in a contracting position. Your education doesn't get you where it used to get you. We are competing globally in ways that we've never been able to comprehend. over and over and over again, we're being consistently shown that what we held on to as a society is no longer as stable. So what do? We cling to those symbolic things that can bring us together and bring us joy. Now, mind you, in the same way that they bring us together, they can be polarizing. But as we cling more to our sports, we want our sports to start reflecting our values more. See, when everything is fine and sports is merely entertainment, you don't care in the 1980s or in 1994 if the Dallas Cowboys were a bunch of sexually abusing, cocaine smoking, party animals, because hey, it's just sports, right? You didn't care in the 80s if some athlete came out and said something really offensive or rude, whatever, he's an athlete. We don't feel that way anymore. It's like, no, I want your sport. And I expect you to reflect my values. Or if you don't reflect my values, at least don't offend them. And no, I spend money watching this sport. So I want it to reflect my business values. I don't like hearing that Peyton Manning and Drew Brees and all these other players are getting concussed beyond human comprehension, and you don't want to pay for it. You know why? Because I don't have good health care either. And that doesn't make me happy. Donald Sterling, and this is a key thing, and I know this is a whole lecture, so I won't get into it, but an interesting thing about Donald Sterling, what that case is really about, yes, on the surface, it may be this sort of discussion of race, but what it's really about is economics, and it's really about employment. It's really about what do we think about people who are bosses and what they should and should not be able to do. There was a time, you can watch Mad Men, there was a time where all your boss had to do was manage the company. That does not exist anymore. You are a representative of your company. You are a brand, so your behavior in and out of the office has a much greater impact on your life than it ever did 50 years ago, and we expect the same out of our owners. And that's what we have been seeing in all these different events. Richie Incognito threatening and attacking one of his coworkers and calling him racist names. We don't like it because we see that as our office place. We don't like seeing Donald Sterling say offensive things because that's our office place. Even if we think like he does, we don't think that's appropriate for the office. And if you see the discussions that say were happening around this whole case, there was arguments about property. What I can and cannot own. Should I or not be forced to sell something that's mine? We have gotten into this higher level of consciousness about our sports because our own lives have become much more tense. And we want to see that reflection. Yes?
Isn't another factor, though, the fact that there are many more cable networks that have to fill 24 hours a day and have to have content to talk about. And that therefore, stories that might have been kind of marginal when we were still in a kind of a print journalism age have now taken on new life because, hey, we gotta talk about something for 2 hours. We gotta talk about something else for 2 hours.
I will tell you this. And we do our sort of discussion at the end. I'm going to go into this more extensively. I completely believe that until I started working in television. It is fascinating to me how much doesn't go on TV. So they have more than enough time. There are more than enough stories to fill the news hour. So, because I used to think the same thing. I used to think, well, of course you guys are running with this because you've got 12 hours of programming, a couple of commercials here and there. You got to keep babbling. No, if you sit in your typical, CNN or MSNBC production meeting or staff meeting, they've got reams of things to cover. And the time is primarily spent saying what we're not going to cover as opposed to we got to cover this to fill the space. That makes sense intuitively, but that's actually not why we've been covering these things more. And I found that out myself because I used to very much have that thought. We're going to try this really quickly, and the off chance that there could be some miracle.
Yeah, this might go like
You were on Mike and Mike?
Yes.
Good job. I like that.
Goodness gracious. Yeah,
It's not connected.
Yeah, that seems to be the
The speaker's open, it's not connected.
literally
to
was
the
working.
recording is. To the.
I wrote an article for the New York Post about when the NFL was determining whether or not they were going to start penalizing people for using the N-word. That's another
Right.
issue that came out recently.
That's right.
And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Post about it, and they read it. They were discussing it on Mike and Mike in the morning. And so I have the video clip of that. But unfortunately, we have no sound for some reason. I should probably send you all this PowerPoint. So a few things about this sort of where these sorts of societal reflections are coming from before we come to our conclusion. So as you can see, since we want our life to reflect, or we want our entertainment to reflect our life more, we want our sports to change with it, okay? We care about Donald Sterling, and we care about Michael Sam, and we care about the Redskins names. And again, this is not ideological. That's what makes it fascinating. People care very strongly about the Redskins name as far as some people want it to change, and some people want it to stay the same. There are some people who are really adamant about, like, give me a bleepity bleep break. It's a name, get over it. And there are other people who very strongly say, you would never have a team called the New York N-words, right? So there you go. That argument's been going on. But suddenly there's a lot more money behind it. And I don't know if anyone noticed this last week, but there was a 2-minute ad. I was going to show it, but I can't. There was a 2-minute ad. How many of you all were aware of the ad? That was, yeah, from the DC area. There was an ad that was created by a coalition of American Indian nations criticizing the NFL, saying, hey, look, we call ourselves a lot of things, but there's no person who's ever used this word to describe themselves in the American Indian community. And what's fascinating is the NFL wouldn't run the ad, right? But the NBA did. The NBA ran it during the NBA Finals, which says a lot about what the NBA wants to be able to reflect branding-wise and politically. Hey, we're the post-Donald Sterling NBA, okay? We have a problem with all of this. You don't tend to see interleague conflicts that way, but the NBA quite literally just threw darts at the NFL. The NBA, you've had NBA owners, you've had Mark Cuban come out and say things like, we're eventually going to overtake the NFL because our sport doesn't give kids concussions. Okay? We're expecting to see that now. We want our sports leagues to reflect those same values. So, what this heads down to, these last two, which I think are really key before we get to our conclusion. Northwestern, the same sort of thing. You have now college football players who are going to unionize.
Why not?
I got it for free. But part of that is because we finally have this discussion of these guys are making hundreds of millions of dollars for their schools, and they don't get any money. They get tuition, but they don't get any money. And there are many people who argue, look, you're being paid for by being able to go to this great institution, and you're getting free training to possibly go into the NFL, so why do you want anything extra? And it's interesting because the notion of players unionizing is actually fundamentally different from a secondary argument, which is right around the corner of whether they should get paid. Because they can unionize and not ask for money. They may just unionize and say, we need better health care, we need better class schedules, we need better resources. We don't necessarily want money, but we don't think it's fair that we play 12 games for your school and we're being flown back and forth. And I say this not to go too far afield, but I thought it was very fascinating. When the college leagues change, right? So let's say you're in the ACC, which is a group of colleges, or the Big Ten, which is a group of colleges, and you see all these different college associations, like businesses, like our jobs that we have, saying, well, we're going to merge with this person, we're going to merge with this person. And we think about it in terms of that basketball player. Oh, well, now that kid at Duke is going to play that kid at Boston, and that kid at Duke is going to play that kid in Florida. And that's cool for basketball, and it's very, very cool for football. But what about the tennis players, whose schedules are now ruined? Those kids aren't going to play tennis professionally. They're playing tennis because it was a way to get a college scholarship. What about the golf team that now has to take 6- and 7-hour bus rides? It's like, I'm a sociology major, I'm an engineer, and I'm on the golf team. I don't have time to travel to Boston just because a bunch of institutions got together and said, we can make more TV money if we join up with Boston College and we join up with Syracuse. So that's why these guys are able to unionize now, because the public thinks about those issues in different ways. And lastly, this. Much of this began, and much of this reflecting of what we want in our lives in sports began with the NFL and the NBA lockouts. And I'm only going to say these quick things about this because I want to be able to have we do the Q&A in the end. The NFL and the NBA lockouts were two of the most contentious and surprising lockouts that we've ever had in professional sports in the history of this country. And not because any games were lost. Because remember, in 1984, the NFL season was cut short. There have been whole hockey seasons that were lost. None of that happened. None of that happened with the NBA, none of that happened with the NFL. But what did happen is this. For the first time in American history, and this has always been polled, the public was on the side of the players. Even though they lost, in my view, they lost both of those negotiations. The public at large was very much in every single poll in favor of the player side in a lockout. That had never happened before in the NFL. It had never happened where you have regular people siding with millionaires against billionaires, right? But is that not what we're dealing with right now in this country? Are we not in a situation where, by and large, we are voting for millionaire politicians to protect us, or at least to keep us in some degree of safety versus billionaires? And why would that not make sense that we want that same relationship in the sports that we consume? So, where's all this going to take us? We're going to watch this, even though I hope it can be watched, even if it doesn't have any sound, because the message is the same. Parasites. Okay. This is a very, very interesting commercial. This was a Nike commercial that started running around 2013. Okay? We're going to watch it in silence, but oh my goodness gracious. Let's see here. On the other side. Maybe we'll be lucky. Beautiful.
The advertisement.
You're making me nervous because I don't even want to touch it anymore in case something happens. Okay. You see the kid in China. You see the kid in America. Notice how they're practicing. Regimented in China, individual behavior in the United States, fame in the United States, team play in China. Practicing on his own. Goes to UNC Chapel Hill, Georgetown, 2 all-American schools. His team wins, but the Chinese player is the #1 draft pick. They continue to compete. He becomes the Rookie of the Year, but the American player becomes the champion. And in the end, in 2030, they're competing in the Olympics. Now, there's a lot to this ad that is very powerful and says where all of this is going and why all of this matters. Number one, it is a very funny play on what actual cultural values are and why we view these sports the way we do. Because they've reversed what actually matters to each country, right? We don't care about team stuff here. We're an individual country. And you notice that throughout the competition, the American player always wins the group competitions, but loses the individual ones. It's the Chinese player who's the #1 draft pick. The Chinese wouldn't care about that as much. They really wouldn't, right? They would care about your team behavior. So the Chinese player becomes the #1 draft pick. The Chinese player becomes Rookie of the Year, but the American player wins the championship. The American player's team wins the championship. And the reason this is beginning to matter is because the future of our political relationship with sports is because since they are now supposed to reflect our values, as our values become more global, as our values become more a reflection of a desire to have a collective identity as a country because our individualist ways of operating don't seem to be working, we're going to be seeing more and more efforts on the parts of sports marketing, on the parts of teams, and on the parts of politicians' relationships with teams to use sports as a way to collectively get our minds to change. We never used sports before to change minds. Sports just happened to change and we changed with it. But now that relationship has changed. Because of what we've seen in this country, we want our sports to change us as much as we want our entertainment to change with what we want. So with that being said, thank you all very much for your time. I'm open to questions. Any questions? Yes.
Well, is Donald Sterling's latest move of hiring private investigative firms actually going to blow up the NBA?
Here's the thing. This is a funny thing about Donald Sterling. And I have some inside information about this because of some people who I happen to know in the league. This is the angry ranting and raving of a man who feels betrayed. That's what this is. And not betrayed by Vivian V. Stiviana, right? He feels betrayed because he knows that there are lots of other owners in the NBA who think and act just like he does, and he's mad that he got caught, and now they're not answering his phone calls. But the problem is this. You've got one smart billionaire lawyer against 32 smart billionaire lawyers. And they have made it very clear to him, no matter what kind of nonsense and shenanigans that you know that we're involved in, that you may have been involved with us. We promise you that if you come after us on this, we'll bury you in ways you can't comprehend. What he's dealing with now is nothing compared to what those other owners would do to him and his reputation if he started trying to reveal other people's snakes and skeletons in the closet. So Donald Sterling is angry because he got caught. Now, I will say this about perhaps the legitimacy of any of the charges or anything against him. And this is a very, I don't think it's a slippery slope. I think this is common sense. I felt the same way about Paula Deen. Okay? You have a right to be a racist in this country. It's awesome, right? We're in America. You can have whatever kind of offensive beliefs you want, and you can keep them to yourself, and that's cool. I don't think anyone should try and keep you from how you feel about black people, white people, Jews, gays, whatever, Christians, Muslims. You can have whatever belief that you want. But what makes our country unique is you can't let it affect your workplace. And the moment you do, we can legally come after you, because that's where it becomes a problem. And in the case of somebody like Donald Sterling, yes, you have some offensive beliefs and you're sleeping with this biracial woman who obviously has some self-loathing issues. Okay, whatever, that's fine. You can do what you want. You're a rich guy. The problem is, now your problem has become everybody else's problem. So we can kick you out for that because he's costing everyone else money. It's not about him being offensive. It's not about a value judgment on his belief system. It's you're costing the league money. And if you're going to cost us money, we don't have to work with you anymore. And it's interesting because people have this discussion of like, well, you can't force somebody to sell your team. Well, actually, he's part of a private club.
Right.
If you're part of a biker gang and they kick you out and they take your leather jacket, they're like, hey, leave the bike too. The bike's part of being in the gang.
He signed a contract that was airtight that the NBA lawyers drafted that basically gave the majority the right to kick out anybody who they didn't like.
Yeah.
Whether they combed their hair the wrong way, they could kick them out.
Right. And they didn't do this lightly. They didn't do this lightly, but this is a very, very unique situation. And the other thing about it, and I'll get to other questions, but the other thing about it is this. Because of the changes that we have seen economically in people's attitudes, this was a player reaction the likes of which no one knew or anticipated. I can promise you, speak to a lot of sports reporters about this, on the air, off site. It's actually a guy on Edge of Sports I was just talking to at MSNBC in DC earlier this week. If this situation had happened, because this isn't an internet thing. It's a tape. Tapes could always be the case, right? If this had happened in 1994, he wouldn't have got kicked out. Because the most prominent players in the league in 94 would have been like Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and Patrick Ewing. And they would have been like, it's playoffs. He sounds like a jerk. And they would have moved on. If this had happened in 2004, the most prominent players in the league would have been Shaq, Kobe, maybe Kevin Garnett. And Kobe Bryant would have been like, wow, what a jerk. Too bad he's their team owner. I got championship rings to win. Okay? But that's not the generation you're dealing with today. The players today, they didn't have to get involved in this. They didn't have to say anything. LeBron James could have been like, wow, that is terrible. Oh, well, and he could have kept going. But he said, no. We already lost a labor fight. We're not going to have this happen. We're going to flex some collective muscle as labor. We are now labor, and that is management. And if there's anything we can do as labor to control how management treats us, we're going to do it. And that was a sea change in sports, to actually see labor collectively get together when money was at stake. They didn't have to do that, and that's how this is sort of different.
I'm just wondering if any of that would be tied into the Occupy movement, where we started developing a consciousness around class and economics.
What's been happening in this country, and I talk about this all the time with how Obama got elected and why Hillary Clinton's going to be president in 2016. She is, whether you like her or not. It's a done deal. That is your president in 2016. Barring some bizarre, inhuman, alien invasion, Hillary Clinton will be elected president in 2016. And here's the thing. At their core, I believe, before they got bought out by, large moneyed interests who wanted to use it to end regulation, at their core, the core Tea Party and the core Occupy were a lot closer together than a lot of people realize. They were complaining about the same thing. These were educated, capable people, and you had the Tea Party people saying, whoa, wait a minute. We just gave $800 billion of our tax money to a bunch of irresponsible banks with no way of knowing if and when they're going to pay us back. Nor have we really determined whether or not we're going to change the rules to make sure they don't do it again in another 18 months. And you had the Occupy people saying, wait a minute. We are being forced as a society to spend millions of dollars to get educations, which are being provided to us by loan sharking banks, and we're not getting any of this money back. They had very similar arguments. And so these players who are coming of age in that level of sort of economic consciousness raising, I think those things are associated. Now, Occupy fizzled for various reasons, and I think the Tea Party has really been sort of corporatized in ways that are unpleasant. But at their core, they were both arguing for what I thought were very similar arguments. And I think our sports teams reflect the same thing. And in particular, not even just with this thing with Sterling, but if you look at what happened with the NFL lockout, the reason that was so significant isn't one thing to have regular players in the NFL. Anyone here know what the base salary is for an NFL player? The base salary for I'm sorry.
Out of your 100,000.
Oh no, it's not that high.
5.
Yeah, it hovers between like 420 and 5, depending on there's a league minimum, right? So you make about $400,000 a year as an NFL player. The catch is that you're an at-will employee. You can be fired at any time. You don't get any of that money. You also are required to, which is so complicated, you're required to actually pay taxes in every city that you play in. It's really complicated. Yeah, that's why, sometimes when you hear these stories like, how did that NFL player blow all his money? It must have been on rims. No, the taxes are horrible. Because basically you're like a contract employee and you've done work in different places. So that check, if you're a Cleveland player, if you're a Cleveland player, it may be fine because at least a couple games, at least 2 of those games are going to be in Ohio, so you're good, right? But when you go to Pennsylvania, if you go to any other state, you're paying taxes in all these multiple locations. I don't care how smart you are. I don't know many 23-year-olds who can figure that out. I don't know many 53-year-olds who can figure out their taxes. And so, but what's interesting is when you have that labor fight, for the first time again in 30-something years, the people at the head of that fight were Tom Brady and Drew Brees and Peyton Manning. These guys didn't have to get involved in that lockout at all. And in the past, players like that would have been like, they wouldn't have had anything to do with it. But they said, no, I know that symbolically, me, Tom Brady, who never has to work again, never has to play again for the rest of his life, it matters that I'm involved in this. So we've seen that on a lot of levels. I don't think that would have happened in the past. And the politics of these guys are different because, Peyton Manning is a big-time Republican, and Drew Brees is a Democrat. I don't know what Tom Brady is. He may be sort of apolitical. But, those guys aren't even on the same side, and they still got together as labor to say, hey, ownership is a problem. So, a couple more. Yes?
Where do you see the country going in regards to these unions? Like, for example, in Ohio, we banned unions from in colleges, or at least the creation of them. And so, I know we have an all-Republican House, governor, etc. So where do you see it going in terms of this discussion?
Here's the thing. We're hitting a really nasty breaking point in this country. And I don't think, as much as, this is the easiest way to put it. You have large corporations and capital moves faster than labor, right? So large corporations can threaten states, say I'm going to go here, go there, go this country, go that country, and that's how they're breaking up unions, right? And for years and years and years, you had all sorts of people saying, well, I don't know if I think unions are a good idea, and unions used to do things, and they don't do good things now, et cetera, et cetera. But now that we're getting to the bare bones resources, people are starting to say, oh, Well, I don't necessarily say I like unions all the way, but I don't really think it's a good idea that, I'm at total at-will employment. And I don't think it's a really good idea that, how my income is derived is completely contingent on what the executives do, and I have no more protections, or some board of trustee member who runs my company, his son-in-law was responsible for investing our retirement funds, and he blew it all, and now all of us employees have to suffer, and we don't have any resources to get that back. That's what your union used to get involved in. If your bosses blew your retirement, your union would get on. You don't have a union, now you're stuck. You're chasing your money on your own. So what I think is going to happen is this. They're going to keep busting unions. Union membership is at an all-time low in this country. The other thing that unions would do is they're a safety valve. And if people don't have a safety valve to express their anger, they get more violent. And they get more frustrated. And that's why you get shootings. And that's why you get people attacking their bosses and committing suicide and engaging in violent actions, because they don't have an outlet to express their economic fears and frustrations. And that's where I think we're going. I don't think we're necessarily going to have riots in the streets in the next 18 months, but I promise you, the more that we eliminate any semblance of unions and collective bargaining in this country, the more that when people don't feel that their needs are met, they're going to find more violent and disruptive ways to express that frustration. Two more.
And to add to that, I guess on the sports context, I know we alluded to it earlier. I mean, you have now Illinois Northwesterns that has been granted by the court that may be overturned any time now, the right to collective bargain. And by any means, Northwestern isn't Ohio State of sports programs. And so now the message has at least changed to the fact of, well, if Northwestern has this whole power to collective bargain, where does that trickle down to smaller schools, like say for Hiram or D2 athletes? Because in the grand scheme of things, you have less than 1% of athletes that make $1 million or so dollars, and even those athletes, at the very least, are getting a lot of things given to them. So by saying that we're going to allow athletes to unionize, does that mean athletes from football to softball? Does that mean all divisions? And if not, then how's that fair?
This is going to end up happening. I think what you're going to... What was the guy's name? The football player from Ohio State who tried to sue to enter the league?
Claret. Oh, yeah, Claret.
Yeah, Maurice Claret.
And he almost made it, too.
Right. And that whole thing blew up in his face, right? But here's what's going to be interesting. And here's how I think this is going to come into play. I think the next institutions that are going to start unionizing, it's going to be big for-profit institutions. And the reason why, because the NCAA is getting weaker and weaker. And you've got more and more players who are like, the NCAA is not doing anything to protect me. They let my coaches run willy-nilly. They don't care if people are getting an education. They're not doing anything about drugs. We as players have to do something to protect ourselves because the league is not doing it. And that's what's going to end up happening. And it's going to be it's going to be a Maurice Claret type situation, because you're going to have a player, right? And I mean, literally this is going to happen. They had that guy from Kentucky, even though he wasn't famous enough. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to have some player who is, who's got money on the table, like he knows he's going to be drafted, and he's going to be forced to do something for the school that ends up injuring him and costing him money, and he's going to sue the school. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have that basketball player who's like, everyone knows this kid's going to be a top 5, top 10 draft pick. And the school's going to say, well, you've got to do these alumni fundraiser things because that's part of you being an active member of the school. And the kid busts his knee, falls down, a table or something else like that, and he's going to be like, you guys cost me millions of dollars. Now, will he win that case? Not necessarily. But what's going to happen is the institutions are going to be like, oh, we got to come up with some deal to inoculate ourselves from this happening in the future. Because you're going to have more and more players saying, I am here at this school to train to get a career. And if anything this school does harms me from that potential income, then the school is liable. And the only way the school saves itself is if you let people unionize and collectively argue on their behalf. So I think if that doesn't happen this year, that's going to happen in the next couple of years. I promise you that's going to occur. Last question. I'm sorry.
It's so obviously going to happen. Why has it not happened already?
Well, because you haven't had a player who is brave enough to do it, and you haven't had somebody who's prominent enough to do it yet. Most of these things are a matter of opportunity and confidence, right? So it would have to be, not LeBron James is sort of this odd example, but, we haven't had a player of that level of prominence get hurt in that way yet, in a sport where they could get away with it. NFL is kind of iffy because it's an injury-prone sport. But if it was a basketball player, they could definitely get away with that. And here's the thing, I don't think that court case would be successful. I don't think you would never win that case. But it would send a shockwave throughout the school. And again, the question would become, well, what does the NCAA do to protect these kids? Because they're not giving them an education. And if you say that you're training them to do these sports, but you're not providing them with the resources to keep their bodies healthy past a certain point, well, shouldn't they have some sort of protection? I mean, that conversation is already being had. That's why you have the players unionizing. But again, someone's going to attach it to money. So, last question, I think goes through.
No, I was just going to say, getting back to your final thing about international.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the San Antonio now, look at the guys playing for San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
You got 2 Frenchmen, a Puerto Rican, a guy from Brazil, I think that's
Argentina.
Argentina.
Yeah.
And they almost exclusively go Europe, primarily because they have found that those players, that 41 minutes, that 41 points that they scored the other night, and I'm a basketball coach for 35 years, I've never seen anybody play a team sport to annihilate a defense like the Heat had.
And it's a good defense, yeah.
And it's a good defense. So that is the direction that I think a lot of people are going. It's very entertaining, boy.
Well, I'll tell you this. There's a couple things about this, and this sort of encapsulated it all, as to why that happened with San Antonio, why that happened in the NBA. That has to do with race and has to do with money. So in 1992, you have the Dream Team. Everybody remembers the Dream Team?
Yeah.
The Dream Team goes and annihilates the planet, right? They didn't lose a game, and they won by an average of 33 points. People across, they never even seen basketball played that way. You guys know who Dirk Nowitzki is?
Yeah.
There's a great interview with Dirk Nowitzki I saw years ago. He said, he remembers seeing that as a kid and growing up in Germany. At that point, he's like, basketball was a girl sport when he grew up. He's like, his mother played for the German basketball. He's like, boys didn't play basketball, but when they saw that, he was like, Dad, I got to do this, right? And so first you had the Dream Team go out, and everybody else in the world got interested and got excited in the sport, right? You have Michael Jordan, blah blah blah. The second thing that you had is Larry Bird retired because he had foot problems, and there weren't white players in the NBA anymore who were any good. Period. Matter of fact, there has not been an American-born white player who was a starting all-star in the NBA in like 10 years. I mean, they were good players, but the league was like, well, we don't think we're going to be able to sell this sport to 50-something-year-old white guys if we don't have any white guys on the court, so we've got to go to Europe. And what they ended up stumbling upon was like, well, hell, there's great players all over the place. We got guys in China, we got guys in Israel, we got guys in Argentina, we got guys in Southern Africa. We should really make this sport international. They stumbled upon it because the plan was to just get white players, and they started realizing they could get great players from all over the world. And so San Antonio in particular has been lucky for this main reason. They have a brilliant coach. Because a lot of other teams have tried to get international players. It's not a lot. Because one thing about international sports is certainly international basketball that a lot of Americans don't realize is guys like Dirk Nowitzki and guys like Tony Parker, they're actually less educated than Americans. Because if you want to play a sport overseas in Europe, you can basically start at 15 or 16 and you can more or less be on like a farm team for a professional franchise at 16 years old. You don't go to high school. You go to a private school run by a team. You don't go to college. You basically become somebody's property at 15. It's fascinating the way that we complain in America about, oh my gosh, these kids should have to at least go to a year of college. European players don't. They don't go to school. They go to basketball sort of training academies from a very, very early age. And so San Antonio went and got a bunch of guys who have basically been trained from birth to play basketball, and they have a good coach to bring it all together. Other teams have tried that. And they haven't been as successful. And I'll say this sort of in closing. I also think this. It took San Antonio 2 games to figure out what to do because they almost, LeBron had got hurt. They were probably going to lose game 1 too. It took them 2 games to figure out what to do. And what they realized is that the only way they could actually beat the Miami Heat was to constantly switch players in and out and make it impossible for the defense to keep switching because they don't know who they're playing against. Because they couldn't beat them. If they played them starters on starters, they were losing the game. So, anyway.
And their coach started an D3 school about as large as Hiram.
Yeah. I mean, he has the real experience. Anyway, thank you guys so very much. I apologize for all the technical things, but I hope this will work out fine. Rodney, you failed me. Like, we literally
I got this.
20 minutes before class, this was working. It's for some reason it's not my fault.
One of your fans, I heard one.
Who owns the problem?
Exactly.
Who owns the problem?
Not me.
That's right, it's not you. Your name wasn't up.
Exactly.
You actually saw me coming. He went down to Charlotte.
I was just there last week.
Hanging out. I went to,